mind bounded by conventional thought and knowledge. For the desire to possess, remember, may easily become importunate, and embodied in this animal form of the subtle body, which acts as its vehicle, may go forth to tear in pieces all it obstructs, to reach to the very heart of the loved object, and to seize it. Au fond, it is nothing more than the aspiration for union, as I said, the splendid and perfectly clean desire to absorb utterly into itself. He paused a moment and looked into Maloney's eyes. To bathe in the very heart's blood of the one desired, he added with grave emphasis. The fire spurted and crackled, and made me start, but Maloney found relief in a genuine shudder, and I saw him turn his head and look about him from the sea to the trees. The wind dropped just at that moment, and the doctor's words rang sharply through the stillness. "Then it might even kill?" stammered the clergyman presently in a hushed voice, and with a little forced laugh by way of protest that sounded quite ghastly. "In the last resort it might kill," repeated Dr. Silence. Then, after another pause, during which he was clearly debating how much or how little it was wise to give to his audience, he continued, "And if the double does not succeed in getting back to its physical body, that physical body might wake an imbecile, an idiot, or perhaps never wake at all." Maloney sat up and found his tongue. "You mean that if this fluid animal thing, or whatever it is, should be prevented from getting back, the man might never wake again?" he asked with a shaking voice. "He might be dead," replied the other calmly. The tremor of a positive sensation shivered in the air about us. "Then isn't that the best way to cure the fool? The brute!" thundered the clergyman, half rising to his feet. "Certainly it would be an easy and undiscoverable form of murder," was the stern reply, spoken as calmly as though it were a remark about the weather. Maloney collapsed visibly, and I gathered the wood over the fire and coaxed up a blaze. "The greater part of the man's life, of his vital forces, goes out with this double," Dr. Silence resumed after a moment's consideration, "and a considerable portion of the actual material of his physical body. So the physical body that remains behind is depleted not only of force but of matter. You would see it small, shrunken, dropped together, just like the body of a materializing medium at a séance. Moreover, any mark or injury inflicted on this double will be found exactly reproduced by the phenomenon of repercussion upon the shrunken physical body lying in its trance." "An injury inflicted upon the one, you say, would be reproduced also on the other?" repeated Maloney, his excitement growing again. "Undoubtedly," replied the other quietly, "for there exists all the time a continuous connection between the physical body and the double, a connection of matter, though of exceedingly attenuated, possibly of etheric matter. The wound travels, so to speak, from one to the other, and if this connection were broken, the result would be death." "Death," repeated Maloney to himself. "Death." He looked anxiously at our faces, his thoughts evidently beginning to clear. "And this solidity?" he asked presently after a general pause. "This tearing of tents and flesh, this howling, and the marks of paws? You mean that the double has sufficient material drawn from the depleted body to produce physical results?" "Certainly." The doctor took him up. "Although to explain at this moment such problems as the passage of matter through matter would be as difficult as to explain how the thought of a mother can actually break the bones of the child unborn." Dr. Silence pointed out to sea, and Maloney, looking wildly about him, turned with a violent start. I saw a canoe, with Sangree in the stern seat, slowly coming into view around the farther point. His hat was off, and his tanned face for the first time appeared to me to us all, I think, as though it were the face of someone else. He looked like a wild man. Then he stood up in the canoe to make a cast with the rod, and he looked for all the world like an Indian. I recalled the expression of his face, as I had seen it once or twice, notably on that occasion of the evening prayer, and an involuntary shudder ran down my spine. At that very instant he turned and saw us where he lay, and his face broke into a smile, so that his teeth showed white in the sun. He looked in his element, and exceedingly attractive. He called out something about his fish, and soon after passed out of sight into the lagoon. For a time none of us said a word. "And the cure," ventured Maloney at length. "Is not to quench this savage force," replied Dr. Silence, "but to steer it better, and to provide other outlets. This is the solution of all these problems of accumulated force, for this force is the raw material of usefulness, and should be increased and cherished, not by separating it from the body by death, but by raising it to higher channels. The best and quickest cure of all," he went on, speaking very gently and with a hand upon the clergyman's arm, "is to lead it towards its object, provided that object is not unalterably hostile, to let it find rest where—" He stopped abruptly, and the eyes of the two men met in a single glance of comprehension. "Joan!" Maloney exclaimed under his breath. "Joan," replied John Silence. We all went to bed early. The day had been unusually warm, and after sunset a curious hush descended upon the island. Nothing was audible but that faint, ghostly singing which is inseparable from a pine-wood even in the stillest day. A low, searching sound, as though the wind had hair and trailed it o'er the world. With the sudden cooling of the atmosphere, a sea fog began to form. It appeared in isolated patches over the water, and then these patches slid together, and a white wall advanced upon us. Not a breath of air stirred. The firs stood like flat metal outlines. The sea became as oil. The whole scene lay as though held motionless by some huge weight in the air, and the flames from our fire, the largest we had ever made, rose upwards straight as a church steeple. As I followed the rest of our party tentwards, having kicked the embers of the fire into safety, the advance guard of the fog was creeping slowly among the trees, like white arms feeling their way. Mingled with the smoke was the odor of moss and soil and bark, and the peculiar flavor of the Baltic, half salt, half brackish, like the smell of an estuary at low water. It is difficult to say why it seemed to me that this deep stillness masked an intense activity. Perhaps in every mood lies the suggestion of its opposite, so that I became aware of the contrast of furious energy, for it was like moving through the deep pause before a thunderstorm, and I trod gently, lest by breaking a twig or moving a stone I might set the whole scene into some sort of tumultuous movement. Actually, no doubt, it was nothing more than a result of overstrung nerves. There was no more question of undressing and going to bed than there was of undressing and going to bathe. Some sense in me was alert and expectant. I sat in my tent and waited, and at the end of half an hour or so my waiting was justified, for the canvas suddenly shivered, and someone tripped over the ropes that held it to the earth. John Silence came in. The effect of his quiet entry was singular and prophetic. It was just as though the energy lying behind all this stillness had pressed forward to the edge of action. This, no doubt, was merely the quickening of my own mind, and had no other justification. For the presence of John Silence always suggested the near possibility of vigorous action, and as a matter of fact he came in with nothing more than a nod and a significant gesture. He sat down in a corner of my ground sheet, and I pushed the blanket over so that he could cover his legs. He drew the flap of the tent after him, and settled down, but hardly had he done so when the canvas shook a second time, and in blundered Maloney. "Sitting in the dark?" he said self